Welcome to Freddy's Huge Ask Podcast. Huge lives and the stories behind them.
3, 2, 1.
And now here's your host, Freddy Cruz.
Kyle Mills returns with another Mitch Rapp novel under the Vince Flynn umbrella titled Oath of Loyalty. And he joins the show right now. Hello.
Hello. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, man, this is great. Glad to have you on. It's been a while. It's been about a year. Enemy at the Gates, the last one, and now the new one.
Yeah, it always seems to fly. I feel like I just finished the Enemy at the Gates, and now here I am again.
How fast do you get through an entire manuscript? Fast being, I guess, 1 month.
It takes me a full year to write one, so I'm always skidding in at the last minute.
When you're like the first draft, is it simply, and I say simply in relative terms, but is it as easy or hard? I guess, is it as easy as vomiting the words out, and then you go back and then you fix everything and you fine sculpt it like a clay pot or something? Like, how does that work?
Some people definitely do that. I write really elaborate outlines. So probably the hardest part of the process for me is writing the outline. They're really long. They're like 100 pages long, more than that sometimes. And then when I do the first draft, I kind of know where I'm going.
Wow. Okay, so it's almost like you're filling in the blanks. I've never heard of someone writing a novel, and it makes sense because you're able to churn these out every year, it seems. It makes sense. So I don't want to oversimplify it, but is it really as easy as plugging in the holes in the descriptions when you've got such an elaborate outline?
Yeah, in a way, if it was a well done outline, but sometimes it's kind of interesting, even when you do a really elaborate outline. Sometimes things don't look as good on the page as you think they do. Or, characters take off in directions that you don't expect because, you're kind of laying out the story in the outline. It's the bare bones. Here's what they're going to do. Here's what information they have to impart in this chapter at this point in the plot. And then when I'm writing it, then the unexpected stuff happens. And, maybe they get attacked in a different way than I thought and everything. And that complicates things a little bit, but usually not too bad. Like I said, I know where I'm going unless I find I've made a huge error, which, sometimes history gets in the way too, where, you're trying to write kind of something feels very current, and then maybe something in current events happens and you have to adjust it because it's a little too on the nose.
What's an instance of that where you've had to kind of tweak or adjust or whether it's a simple tweak or a major adjustment, and you're like, this is not what I wanted, but okay, real world, here we are?
Well, that's happened to me a few times. The worst one though was Enemy at the Gates. My last book, the one right before this one, that was intended to be kind of this 3-book arc about the fall of American democracy and, sort of taken down from within.
Yeah.
And then I finished the first draft or something when, all the talk about stolen elections and January 6th happened and all that. And it was too close to what I had written.
Yeah.
So I had to change that and then sort of give up on the idea of that 3-book arc. And what you see with the current book is me closing out sort of that arc. It took me 2 books to kind of close out that storyline and back away from it a little bit.
And there's a passage in here that talks about American democracy being more delicate than they were willing to admit. And what is that like? Is that part of that, or I feel like you danced the line rather gracefully when you're talking about when you're talking about America imploding from within. There's the passage about American democracy being delicate. One of the characters talking about that, and then there's another one at the beginning talking about civil war being between 400 different factions. which is quite humorous, a little scary because it's accurate. But yeah, I mean, how did it feel to you when you're fleshing out all these ideas?
Yeah, a little depressing when when I was doing it, and it kind of to some extent played out in real life. It's it's an interesting concept. I think it was James Madison said that all democracies eventually commit suicide.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if you look at history, it's kind of true. And so it's just, I thought it was an interesting thing. It would be an interesting thing to explore over like 3 books. Also because I'm kind of a criminal at heart. I really like villains. I like writing villains, and I like coming up with their evil plots. And I was really interested in the idea of how would you do it?
I just like that you
And
said
I
you're a
touched on
criminal
this.
at heart. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think we all are, everybody that's in this business, because you've got to come up with these scenarios that are all about the crimes. And, I was kind of interested in, like, if I was president, how would I do it? How would I turn myself into a dictator? And you could read the history of different countries that have had this happen to them and things like that. And so I kind of had it all planned out in my head. And then, it's funny that it was so much faster. That happened so much. The January 6th and all the stuff about stolen elections happened so much faster and was so much better tolerated by people than I thought. That honestly, my book that I had planned in my head that I changed, this was the last one, Enemy at the Gates, seemed a little mild. So, I mean, I didn't have riots at the Capitol or anything like that. I'd say I feel like 5 years ago that would have been unrealistic. People would have read that and said, "Oh, this is kind of far-fetched."
Yeah. Well, and you've definitely got a grasp on human nature and how, we all have the same brain. That's the same wiring from tens of thousands of years ago. And so I think that's part of being able to craft a story, is being able to get inside the head of somebody. And when you talk about democracy being so fragile in the story, and then going back to James Madison, you really hit the nail on the head. And it goes back to kind of towing that line. And one of the things that I really liked about the story was that you danced. It's like you crossed the line, but then you danced your way back across, and then you walked on the line, and then you stuck a right foot out and kind of did the hokey pokey, and then you turned yourself around and came back across the line, and then you lose track of how many times you've crossed the line. Then the line just completely disappears.
Hopefully I work hard to do that. I mean, one thing that's important to doing that is, you'll notice in my books, and people are funny because they send me emails about how mad they are that, I don't know, I was beating up on Trump, and then the next time I'll get something saying I was beating up on Hillary Clinton or Obama or something, which is exactly what I want. You'll notice the words like Republican and Democrat never appear in my books.
Yeah. Because
I never talk about which party it is, because I don't think it's important. These threats come from all sides. Mm-hmm. And, from the American people too. So it's, democracy is hard. America's been really good at it. But, if you look at, most countries in the world, Arab countries and stuff, it's hard for people to tolerate somebody they hate being in power. And that's by definition in the United States, half the time people you hate are going to be in power. It's just like the way it goes in democracy. And people seem to want a lot. I think there's a lot of tolerance right now for people to change that, to turn them into, something that more resembles Russia or Iran, where you have elections, but, we all know who's going to win ahead of time.
Quote unquote elections.
Yeah, exactly. You go, but, it's, if you vote for the right party, you win. If you vote for the wrong party, you're going to lose. And I think I think that could be seductive, thinking, that, my guy's always going to be in. But, it's interesting because people will talk about that, or they'll talk about, Russia and Hungary or places like that. And, in kind of admiring them, but they don't ever go on vacation there. They don't ever want to move there. And so these are not successful countries. I mean, I spent a month once in Hungary doing research, and yeah, it's a lovely country. Budapest is really pretty, but you don't want to live there. So, all the places you want to go on vacation, France, Spain, Italy, all thriving democracies, all the really mostly, wealthy countries, democracies, so it's that push-pull, as unsatisfying as it is, has produced, after a couple hundred years, the most powerful and successful country in the world. So hopefully people will remember that at some point. It's funny, I spent a lot of time in Spain, and it's interesting. Their perspective is very interesting because they lived under a brutal dictatorship until, I was in high school. So they have very clear memories of what that's like.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about too, because you hit the nail on the head with democracy being, well, half the time you're not really going to win, and that half the time people that you don't necessarily care about, in some cases that you absolutely loathe, are going to be lording over you and doing things with your tax money. And then you're like, well, what's the alternative? A king, a dictator, a vice chancellor?
Yeah, it's not a great alternative. I mean, the people will say, both about Obama and Trump, that he's not my president. And I always respond, he's absolutely, both of them, absolutely my president. Yeah. They were elected, and now I hope that they do really well and that the country does great under them. I'm rooting for anybody who gets elected as president of the United States, I'm rooting for. And so when you look at the book I wrote, you had this guy who had this long-term plan of gaining kind of permanent power in the United States, and his, base, we're up for that. And I think that was something I wanted to progress through multiple books, but again, it turned out, I thought that was going to be a hard thing to sell, which is sort of funny now looking back on it, that could happen. But now it was a much easier sell, but it felt like I don't ever want to be seen that I'm writing an editorial about, Donald Trump or Barack Obama or something like that. I think that's boring.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you, as someone fascinated with this kind of writing and fascinated with just kind of not so much the actual current events, but the reaction to the current events, and realizing, well, it's all the same system and none of these people are really different, or none of these people are really, there's not much difference between these people.
No,
because
it's really comes down to power.
Yeah.
There are people who really, really crave power.
Yeah.
And slit their own mother's throats for it.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, those are the people that get it a lot of times.
Yeah. It's more, I guess from my perspective, it's more of a people watching thing. And just kind of seeing how things play out, and I'm like, and there are people in my family who think one way, who think another way, think, kind of sort of like me, who's like a little atheist when it comes to this kind of stuff. And it's just interesting to see people's reactions to it. And it's not a judgment call. It's just interesting to me. And I don't know, I guess maybe that's where I kind of have in common with you, seeing that dark side of where some of this stuff takes us and where some of this stuff leads, and seeing how things play out, and reading like a worst case scenario, like in Oath of Loyalty, which is just mind blowing because it goes back to Mitch Rapp crossing so many different lines. And I want to go to something that you had touched on, and that's researching some of the places where you've gone. And out of all the countries you've been to, what's a specific place, not so much a country, but a specific place that the average person would find unattractive that you found to be breathtaking?
Oh man, there are a lot of them that showed up in a book. I would say maybe like Lesotho in Africa is a really beautiful country, but they were when I was there, they were really getting hammered with AIDS. And I remember it was very striking, and this was a scene in a book a few books ago, that usually about the only permanent structure was always this big cinder block building, and it was the mortuary because so many people were dying of AIDS at the time. So you'd have this incredible landscape, rural landscape, and whenever you went through a town, there was normally these big round kind of huts that people lived in, except for that one cinder block building with mortuary written on it in paint on the side. And I thought that's got to make it into a book someday. It's such a really stark image.
And you write about Uganda in this book. It's where one of the characters has his compound. It was in Enemy of the Gates, which is the last book. Mm-hmm. How do you see things playing out with Africa in the real world, seeing as how you've been to places in Africa? I mean, how do you see things turning out for them? I mean, are we talking like before we die? Are we ever going to see things change for the positive when it comes to this kind of these countries?
No, I don't think so. I think Africa seems to go sort of back and forth in a small, like a little pendulum in a kind of a narrow range, unfortunately. I mean, China's getting much more involved there, but I don't think that's to the Africans' benefit in the long run. So, no, I think it's going to kind of remain the way it is, and which I think is hard for the people who live there. It's a fascinating place, though. I've spent a lot of time, particularly in South Africa, where I've sat. Mitch Rapp has a house there now because I was so familiar with it, and it gives him a nice base of operations for that part of the world. But yeah, some of my favorite places in the world are in Africa. So it's fun to write about, and it's so foreign. I don't think people know that much about it. It doesn't loom very large in U.S. news. So I always think it's fun to read a book about something you don't know much about.
Yeah, it's fascinating. What's something that we here in the States don't ever see about Africa, aside from its beauty? Because it seems to me like when we do learn of Africa, it's some kind of disease or a military dictatorship that's fallen or that has taken over. We see the bad. It's like right. If it bleeds, it leads. So what's something that's mind blowing about the area, seeing as how you've spent so much time there, that we wouldn't see?
I think the thing that struck me the most about going to Africa is the sense of tribalism, which is interesting because now I see it in the United States much more. But when I first went, it's almost because I was living in Cape Town. And once you're there for a while, you sort of get assigned to a tribe, and people treat you. They kind of decide on how they're going to treat you based on the tribe that you're involved in, and less about it's this label that you kind of carry around with you, and it's probably the way African Americans feel a little bit, that they feel sometimes that they've been labeled. They walk into a store or whatever, and they've been stereotyped, and it's kind of the same there. Because you get slotted into the white tribe. So my tribe was just white, not American, not British, none of that. Just you're part of the white tribe now, and this is how we feel about you. So I thought that was really interesting. And then obviously all the black tribes that are there too, all treat each other really differently. So it was kind of when all the tribalism between the two political parties started to really flare up in the United States. It was interesting because I had a pretty strong picture in my head of how that works, or doesn't work, how that doesn't work in a country when it happens. So I think I had a better understanding of what was going on than most people.
I'd love to do a little bit of a lightning round before we wrap up the interview, Kyle, beginning with, if Mitch Rapp could give a TEDx talk, what would it be about?
Oh, definitely shooting people in the head.
If Mitch could pick one person to be on his team, who would it be? Bob Lee Swagger, James Reith, or Scott 1T Harvath? Choose wisely.
Oh, I feel like Scott Harvath because he's been around so long. They've got the same background.
If Bob Lee Swagger, James Reese, or Scott Harvath were on Mitch Rapp's team, who would be most likely to turn on him? Choose wisely.
Maybe James Reese. He's pretty volatile.
He is crazy. I love James.
Yeah, he's a fun character to read about.
What was the last book you read, and what are you currently reading?
Let's see. What was the last book I read? God, I can't remember. I'm actually currently rereading The Stand. It's funny that I can't remember the last book I read. That's terrible. This age.
It's all good. I don't give you a day over 30. If you could go back in time and co-write any book, what would it be and why?
Oh man, that's an interesting. Probably The Cardinal of the Kremlin, because I just thought it was the ultimate, Cold War thriller, and I loved that period of history for the thrillers that were produced. I loved the Soviet Union as an opponent. I regret a little bit not having been born a little earlier, so I could have been a Cold War thriller writer. I love those books.
Okay, so that's a favorite Cold War book of yours. Now I got to ask, what's your favorite Cold War era movie, like a thriller movie?
Oh, yeah. I'm going to go to Clancy again. I love The Hunt for Red October.
KyleMills.com, all one word, KyleMills.com. You can find out more about all the things he's doing. He's got the new one. It's called Oath of Loyalty. It is out right now. Please go get this book. It's going to blow your mind in more ways than 10. I can tell you that. Find him on the socials as well. Tell him how awesome it is. And do an author a favor. Leave him a review after it blows your mind, because it will. And Kyle, I really appreciate you joining the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Freddy's Huge Ask podcast.